So thank you very much for the privilege of coming to talk to you tonight. I'm actually in Kuala Lumpur, believe it or not. That's where I live these days. But I'm still very much involved in many things in Australia. Now, this is, there's no mystery about this. This is a controversial topic in Australia. And so I'm aware of that. But I think it's a very important topic that we need to talk about. So we can accept that a lot of people are feeding birds. I'm really interested as an ecologist what happens when that happens, when we do that. And there'll be all sorts of other things to go along with it. So I think we need to start elsewhere where it's unequivocally a big deal. In the United States, of course, it's a huge industry worth $4 billion a year worth of, and people spend it on all these gadgets that you can see. But one statistic that really sat out for me was just how much seed is put out every year. So, I can just tell you, I could say how many kilograms and that sort of thing. Is just a big number. I'd like to illustrate that with this following thing. So here is a train, coal train. Imagine instead of coal, those things were full of seed, mostly, sunflower seed and all the other seeds that birds eat. There's approximately 100 bogies there on the screen. But what you need to be aware of is every single year, 22,000 carriages worth of seed are put out for the birds every year. That's utterly ridiculous and unbelievable, just that sort of amount. So that's a lot of seed. Here's a couple of robins. We've crossed the Atlantic and we're now in England, of course. And they're obviously full of the mealworms that are there, but nobody's taking any notice of them. These robins have two things to tell us. First of all, none of the food that's actually put out in vast quantities all around the world, none of that is actually needed by the birds. And secondly, none of it is part of their natural diet. Not any of the seeds that we put out or the various things that are put out for the birds are actually part of their natural diet wherever that is occurring. We are providing a whole lot of different things, and they're being attracted to people's backyards. But nonetheless, all of it's eaten. Every last morsel of it is eaten. So what I'm really interested in is what happens then. Now, if we just need to go back a bit about this as a pastime, it started very simply. It was just a do-it-yourself thing. Back in my day, I'm not that young anymore, but everybody had a budgie or a sparrow. No, a canary. That's what I'm trying to think of. A canary in the backyard or in a cage or something. So there might have been a little bit of bird seed for them, and so you could get some seed and provide it for the birds that were coming. Whack up a tray or something, make up a bottle as a feeder. Those kinds of things. There was nothing you could buy. There was just cage bird seed or scraps just from the kitchen table. That's changed completely. Since the 80s now, it is a gigantic global industry worth billions of dollars all around the world. The amount of devices and seed mixes and things available, especially in the northern hemisphere, is utterly bewildering. It's incredible. So it's a very big deal around the world. One of the first innovations was an actual hanging feeder, where you actually needed to buy some hardware, a device that allowed the birds to find the food. Now, this one is the first, a modern version of the first model. It pretty much hasn't changed. It was a cylinder that you can see through, so you can see how much seed is left, and the birds can see it as well. And so that's how it started in terms of the hardware available for feeding birds. But it's now beyond comprehension of what's going on. This is called the Crystal Dome, which you buy in England and Europe, and it'll cost you £750, if you like. The bluefits will eat it even if it's on the top of a jam jar, but some people are buying these kinds of things. And I had a tour of the largest warehouse that provides bird feed and everything and all sorts of other feed around. And it was just completely staggering, just the sheer volume of apparatus and types of food that are available. And I said to my guide, what's the strangest thing in here that you sell, you know? And he showed me this, which is hedgehog pate, organic hedgehog pate. It's not made of hedgehogs, it's for hedgehogs. And he said, can you believe it, people buy this stuff? And what he then revealed is it's actually cat food with a different label. So you could buy the cat food for 50 pence probably, but this stuff will cost you £7. So it's a big thing that's going on. All right, here's my ecological question. What actually happens when all that food is consumed by all those birds in all around the world? Now, the problem is there's been very little research done on this kind of stuff. Mostly there has been lots of research done, however, on wild birds and the role that food has in their lives. And that they're called supplementary feeding experiments. So they're done by natural scientists out in the forest or wherever the birds live. And they manipulate the availability of the food to see what happens. You know, all the different sorts of things might happen. And that's the best way we've got of understanding what happens in people's backyards where all this urban bird feeding is going on. There's been a little bit of stuff done recently, but most of the time it's these experiments done for other reasons, but just wonder what goes on. And so I can summarise literally thousands of studies with a couple of simple things to tell you. Whenever we feed birds, the following things happen. The birds that are fed, they survive winter better. And remember that this is the Northern Hemisphere primarily. And so these birds are being provided with food and therefore fat and reserves and easy to get food during the winter. And so they're much likely to survive the harsh winters that they have in the Northern Hemisphere. When we provide food for birds, they start breeding earlier, sometimes up to a month earlier than they would normally. They have more feeding attempts. So if one fails or they get rid of one, they might start early, get rid of one lot of fledglings and then start again because they've got plenty of time. And in all cases, this leads to the fourth thing. When we feed birds, they produce more offspring. So there are going to be more birds as a result of all the feeding that's going on. That's one thing. Now that might sound like an absolutely wonderful thing, but we have to remember what types of birds are actually coming to the feeders. So here is, and another thing that happens is that's not natural, and that's the other thing is when we feed birds, it concentrates a whole lot of birds into one location, the feeder, and that inevitably leads to a competition. Now, what would never happen in most situations in the real world is that lots of species would never have anything to do with each other. They wouldn't be coming to the same place for the natural food that they provide. They'd be on the ground or up in a tree or in a shrub somewhere feeding on the seeds or the nectar or the plant or the insects on the ground or something like that and avoiding each other. But we artificially concentrate them into one place. You don't need to worry too much about this graph. All it's saying is this is a hierarchy of British birds and it talks about the dominance. The birds are continuously fighting over access to the food that's available. And believe it or not, the little humble house sparrows on the top is the victor in just about every case. All those other birds down there get beaten up by house sparrows. It's not just the house sparrows alone. They come in groups and flocks. And so it's the social orientation of the house sparrow that allows them to live. But there's another thing. We are leading to more competition and aggression between birds. And the other thing about feeders is they attract feeder birds, the birds that will eat the sorts of food that is available to them through the feeders that are out there. Now, most of the time, most of the food that we provide around the world is some sort of seed. So naturally, that's just the granivores. Now, around the world, in the Northern Hemisphere, that's a big range of birds, most of them small, but they are all naturally granivorous birds. It's not the case in Australia, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We don't really have that many granivorous birds that come into our backyards. So the feeders, you could buy this expensive feeder if you like, and people do by the lot. Lots of them are being delivered to households in Australia. I'm not sure what's going to eat them because they just don't work for Australian birds. So you get a greater diversity. To get a greater diversity of species, you have to have a greater diversity of food. At the moment, just putting out seed is not going to give you that greater diversity. Now, one thing that a student of mine working in Auckland found was that feeding changed the bird community. Now, this is in someone's backyard in Auckland. Can you notice what the birds are there? Spotted doves and house sparrows. Now, this is despite the fact that the people who fed the birds, when asked why they put out food for birds, said, we like the birds, we want to have more native birds. And they were thinking of primarily the tui, which is their noisy miner, if you like. It's a beautiful bird, but it's also aggressive to everything else. And a grey, this is called a grey warbler. And there's also silver eyes as well. They're the sorts of birds that the people want to attract. And yet when they put out the food, these other dominant introduced birds are the ones that come. So in fact, what they want is not happening. So that's another thing that happens when we feed birds. We don't get what we think we're going to get. The other thing about it is the more feeders there are, the more birds you get, but not more species. Now here's a gorgeous bird. This is probably the favourite bird, a favourite feeder bird in North America, the cardinal. And here is a graph showing you the density of feeders, like individual hanging feeders, like the one that was on the last slide. Have a look along the bottom row there. This is showing you how many feeders there are per square kilometre. If you like, there's over 2,000 feeders per square kilometre in some places in North America. And these are the number of birds. It's up to 6,000 per square kilometre. And this is a relationship that's startling, that the more feeders, the more birds, but not more species. In fact, when you look at how many species there are, not just individual abundance, you get less, slightly less with more feeders. So putting out a feeder doesn't get you more birds, and certainly not more native birds. So this is, something that everybody who's involved in feeding needs to be aware of. Another thing that happens is there's been some really big changes in behaviour. This is a blackcap. Now, blackcaps spend they breed in Central Europe, places like Poland and Germany especially. And what they normally did was flew south into Spain and North Africa when it got cold. That was the standard thing. They were little migratory birds that don't like being too cold, and they would go down south where it's hot. And then they'd return back to Germany or wherever it was later in the year when it warmed up. But there was always a subsection of them, just a small group of them, which did the wrong thing and went northwest, basically, into Britain. And everybody, all the bird watchers since the 1940s and 50s, knew that blackcaps would turn up in winter in Britain, having come completely the wrong direction. And so that was very strange. But there were just a few of them, and there was kind of an anomaly that the bird watchers kept an eye on, but it wasn't much more than that. But in the 80s, people started putting out feeders for these birds. And the type of food that these birds would eat is not seed, but fat. It's cold, and so there are lard balls, and you can buy a whole range of different products, all to do with fat. And the blackcaps absolutely loved it. And what's happened over the last 30, 40 years is the proportion of blackcaps that visiting Great Britain has gone through the roof because there's so much food available. The other thing that's happening also in Europe is it's getting warmer, so the winters are not so harsh anyway. Now look at the distance between Great Britain and Germany. It's about a third or a quarter of the distance than it is from Spain. Now, what that meant was birds going to Britain were in better condition. They had a shorter visit back. And so they would arrive sometimes a month earlier than the ones that are doing the standard, normal, traditional route of going down to Spain. And when those Spanish birds would arrive, all the good spots, all the good breeding spots have been taken, and all the good mates have been taken by the English visitors who have come back early. So that's a huge thing. This is something happening on an evolutionary scale, and we don't know. That's just one bird. That's probably many others are being used as well. This is crossing the Atlantic again. This is in California this time, or the west coast of North America. This is Anna's hummingbird, a gorgeous tiny little bird. It's a nectar feeder, of course, and it was usually found in the southern parts of California and even down into Arizona and the top of Mexico. And this is just the standard that's the distribution of where they were in winter. This is where they are now in winter. So that's what, 20, 30 years later. And now they are all the way up into the southern part of Canada. And that means truly extraordinary things like this. This is something that never should happen. This is a hummingbird in the snow. Now that is ridiculous because those birds really, they're tiny. They have a very serious metabolism. They have to be powered by insects, not just sugar, in order to survive. And yet here is a hummingbird in Vancouver, Canada, in winter, being provided with artificial nectar from an artificial feeder that has a heater in it. That's the only way that the nectar is going to freeze solid. And those birds they are now completely dependent on those feeders. If the feeder fails, they die. So there is another example of something truly extraordinary going on, a dramatic change in the behaviour. To change something as fundamental as migratory behaviour, and in this case, in the case of some Anna's hummingbirds, turn it off altogether, is a really profound change. So what else is going on? Do birds feed on, do they really need the food that's there? In the 1990s, two people were very interested in other birds actually, do they really need the food that's in the feeders? Now, this is a chickadee, and it was studied in Maine. And these people decided, they've been studying the birds for years and years and years, 25 years of feeder research in winter in Maine. And this was all about how do they survive, what are they doing, what food do they need, all that sort of stuff. And so the researchers decided, do they need our feeders? Let's just turn off the feeders in two populations that we're studying and see what happens. Now, you would never get away with that these days. The ethics departments, the committees would never allow this to happen. But these people decided to test whether the birds were dependent on the feeders. They've been doing the study for 25 years, and so they simply didn't put out any food in those feeders because they were interested in what proportion of them, if any, would survive winter without the feeders. This was the truly extraordinary thing. Comparing the fed populations with the unfed populations, there was absolutely no difference in survival over winter. No one could believe it, but it's extremely well done. So this was one of the first times that the suggestion that the birds may not be dependent on the food was even suggested. Everybody assumed that birds are dependent on the feeders. So there's no evidence of dependency. And this has now been looked at in lots of different birds all around the world. I was really interested in this topic as well, because when you see magpies, and magpies are the most commonly fed bird in Australia, lots of people who are really seriously opposed feeding always say, and so do the people who love feeding, the thing that they're most concerned about is, are the birds going to be dependent on this food that we provide for them? Now, I was studying magpies anyway. I was studying the aggressive ones, and we decided that we'd look at this. And we knew that there were lots of pairs in our populations that we were studying that were being fed, and we found lots of other ones that weren't being fed, and we compared them. We were interested in what they fed themselves, what did they eat themselves, if there was food available from feeders, and what did they feed their chicks? And here's what we found. So this is what did they feed their chicks. Now, you can see there that the unfed birds fed mostly natural food. The blue bar is natural food. What was completely shocking and unbelievable to us, because we just assumed if you've got 3 or 4 noisy magpie babies to raise, you're going to just fly over to Mrs. Smith's meat tray and bring back the meats, aren't you? No, 72% of the birds, even though they had access to a feeder close by, 72% of the food they provided for their own chicks was the natural stuff. They still went out and got the natural food, the worms and grubs, the natural way. And so we concluded that parent magpies have a no junk food policy. So this showed us and suggested to us very strongly that magpies at least weren't dependent on the food that we were providing as well. What we did find evidence for was extreme level of dependency among the humans. The people providing the food were completely dependent on feeding the birds. They couldn't give it up at all. And yet we were showing that they didn't need to feed, they didn't need the food in the feeders. And I have spent a lot of time counselling lots and lots of people, and this is probably the most important take-home message that I've got. There are people out there who haven't been able to go on holidays for years because they think the birds are all going to starve to death if they don't keep feeding the birds. So I've got really terrible news. You could give up feeding tomorrow and you know what will happen? Nothing. The birds will just go up the street to the 6 other feeders in the providing food in your yard, in your area anyway. But even if everybody stopped feeding, that won't be a problem because the feeders, the birds are using the feeders for a bit of a snack and not for a meal. And I think that's actually incredibly important to know. They don't need the food. They only take a little bit. And so therefore it's fine to feed them because it's not got very much. And that's a really important discovery to make. So that's one thing. The most important thing that people are concerned about is, do the birds become dependent on the feeders? The second thing that's of serious importance is disease. Do feeders spread disease? And this one really matters because they do. Now, this is a house finch, one of the common feeder birds in North America. And this is a house finch suffering from, it's just called the house finch disease. It's a type of conjunctivitis. And it's spread from feeders. The birds would never normally get together to feed on the seed if it was naturally available, but they do get together at the feeders and they catch this conjunctivitis from each other. And it's had a huge impact. It's reduced the population by 30% in the eastern United States. Disease really does happen. It happens in England as well. Here is the story of the greenfinch. Now, the populations, this was three different species of birds were studied when a type of food that was provided for them called a Niger seed, a little tiny black seed which you can't even get in Australia, was provided, and the greenfinches absolutely loved this stuff, and they took off. Their population rose until that's the greenfinch at the bottom, but it's also, that's the food. That's an American goldfinch, but that's showing you the food and what it likes. It's a tiny little silvery black seed. The population of the greenfinch plummeted in 2006 when a disease came along that was also spread from the feeders. And that population has plummeted by 38% over that time, and it's still going down directly as a result of the feeding and catching diseases at the feeder. So this stuff really matters. If you're going to feed, you've got to be really careful about what you do. That's the disease. So let me just summarize a few things here. Remove that. Okay, what's different about Australia? There's a lot of people feed in Australia. There's a huge participation rate. In fact, the proportion of people that feed in Australia is exactly the same as it is in North America and the UK. Lots of people feed birds. I predict, I've estimated 3.5 million people feed birds every single day. Now, that's probably news to people because everybody has assumed, like I did, that people in Australia don't feed birds. They do in an enormous way. Here is some double bath. Yeah, double baths, I think. Yeah, and from one feeder in Brisbane. You can see a few birds there. And the people who feed are strongly motivated. They really care about their birds. They just want to see them. They want to help them. And they would be shocked and horrified if anything that they were doing was harming the birds themselves. They just want to enjoy them and they care about them. That's really strong. But the problem is in Australia, there's no information available and there's nowhere you can go. There's no advice. So of those millions of people, most of them keep a very low profile because everybody knows what the situation will be. If you went to your ranger or the local government or you asked the people from Birds Australia or anybody else, what should you feed the birds? You'll get one message alone. You can't feed the birds. You shouldn't feed the birds. They'll all die of terrible disease and they'll become dependent and you really shouldn't do it. And that's not going to change their behaviour. It just means that they don't know what to do. So this is what led me to, and they're isolated. They don't know who to talk to. They're really scared often in all sorts of situations. It's now occurs to me, and I was thoroughly opposed to bird feeding, just like so many other people. But it turns out that bird feeding is the most easy to do and intimate form of interaction with wildlife that you can do. Anyone can do it. You can stick out a bit of food and the birds, wild birds will come to your place and visit you. And that is an enormous way to connect with nature that's very important for lots of people. So I wrote 2 books. One was a big survey of the whole world of bird feeding all around the world. And the final words in this book are, we think our feeders are for the birds. Our feeders are actually for us. We feed because we like the birds to come. Thankfully, the birds don't mind the coming. And as long as we do it properly, we can do it. We can do it without too much harm. Now that book was just a survey of what's going on around the world. But everybody then wanted to know, you mean it's possible that we could feed birds without doing harm? So I wrote a second book, this one, Feeding the Birds at Your Table, a guide for Australia. And this is, talk about controversial. I got into big trouble for writing this, but I was completely motivated, having discovered that lots and lots of people are feeding birds and they're not going to stop. I ethically couldn't make this call. I couldn't say, just stop feeding the birds because they simply won't. So I decided to write a book, that provides information on how to do it properly, not to be worried about it, I'm convinced that you can do it properly as long as you take things seriously. And the last words in this book are, let's start this change today at your place. Start by thinking seriously about why you like to feed. Think about what you are offering the birds. Ensure that your table is always clean, that's the feeder. And then just enjoy. And that's still my case now, a couple of years later. This has been incredibly successful, this book. Obviously, lots of people wanted to find out about it. And so that's where I stand today. I think we can do it properly. Gone are the days when we just demonise everybody who's feeding birds. It can be done properly. These people love their birds. Let's try and do it properly. And I will stop sharing the screen now and see how we go. Caught you by mistake.
Yeah, can I ask you a question, mate?
I think there's a moderator who's dealing with all of that. Let's just make sure.
Yeah, sorry, I had to race. So can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, I had to race over. I was watching from another part of the room, and I've had to race back over to the
Jax wants to ask the question, but how are we going to run this?
Yeah, so I will. I'll just first, say thank you very much, Darryl. That was an excellent presentation and really informative and and fascinating. Some of those test cases, you've sort of examples that you've shown. So yes, what I will do is we'll be open for questions, and we'll take, because Jack's first out the gate, we'll start with questions from Zoom, and then when that seems to be petering out, we'll come and we'll finish with questions from the floor here at the Wetland Centre. So yeah, without further ado, I'll pass back and ask away, Jack.
What's your evidence that millions and millions of Australians feed Australian native birds?
17, I think we're up to surveys now done all over Australia on how many people, like we actually asked people, do you feed birds and why, and all that kind of information. There was definitely the biggest survey that was ever done was done back in 2003. There was a TV program called I've forgotten what it's called. It was the ABC ran it, and they invited people to go onto their website and tell them about the birds and the other wildlife that came to their backyards. And they also just had a simple question in there: do you feed birds, and which birds come, and what's going on? 54,000 people replied to that survey, and that's one of the places that we got the survey from. It's around about where in every population it's between 25% and 52% of the neighbourhood houses somebody's feeding the birds. You might not think that, but that's what's going on. It's huge.
I am amazed.
Yep, I was amazed as well, completely. I had no idea that was the case. So, we're looking at a third to more than a half of people in Australia are feeding birds.
Could you send to the club that those things you've done to say that many people are feeding Australian birds?
Absolutely. Yeah. And
post it to the club?
Yep, absolutely. I've got the papers, and it's in those. It's the book, the blue book that I showed you, the birds at my table, has got all that data as well in an easy way to understand. But I can send the actual papers as well. So later on, I will ask the people who run the show here to give me. Oh, okay. I guess I can just send it to the website, to the email address, but I'll send a bunch of things that people might be interested in.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that, Darryl. Okay. I can't see people. Oh yeah, Darryl, your camera's off. You're able to turn it back on?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
Now I'm looking off up there because I've got.
Yeah.
Okay, and now I can see other people as well, just in
You
case.
can see the storm clouds in Malaysia behind me.
So there's a few. What I'll do, I've got the chat open now, so there might be a couple of questions in there. So I'll just go through those because I've got those open, and then we'll go back out in case other people want to ask them over Zoom. But Mattia says, fascinating talk, Darryl, with the graph of more feeders versus avian density. Could part of that be that more birds lead people to put out more feeders?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I like your critical thinking there. That's definitely what's going on. Lots of people are convinced that if you put out food and the birds eat it, they must be desperately hungry. And so you put out more food and more birds come and the birds are they're seriously just snacking. I should have said that in the talk, and I'll say it now. My summary of what's going on when the birds come to visit your feeder at your place is they're having a snack. They're having a cup of tea and a Tim Tam. They're having a chat, and then they're on their way. It's not a food. We're not providing a 3-course meal. We can't. We are incapable of knowing what those birds need today in terms of nutrition. But it's a little snack. We can enjoy their presence, and then they're on their way. As long as we don't provide crap food like Tim Tams or bread, and we'll talk about bread. We should talk about bread. Or mince. We should talk about mince. There are plenty of other things you can feed as well. And so this book's got all the information you need. Okay, no, it's great.
Okay.
I think it's got everything.
But yeah, well, one of the questions that's up on the chat is, thanks, Darryl, fascinating. This is from Keith. Thanks, Darryl, fascinating. Why is it harmful to feed birds bread?
Yes, that's a good question. It's not the bread. The bread isn't poisonous or dangerous or anything like that. The biggest problem with bread is there's so much of it fed. Now, just think of every pond in the universe has grandma and the kids down chucking out bread tomorrow afternoon and every afternoon forever. And all that bread is just space. It's got not enough nutrition, and it fills up the gut of those birds and their stomachs. And it means the things that they should be feeding, they can't. They're incapable of filling up their food. Now, the birds should be sensible and say, this is terrible. We shouldn't be feeding this sort of stuff. But of course they don't. It's easy to get and all that sort of thing. So it probably tastes nice. It's probably tastes nicer than a tadpole or whatever they normally should be feeding on. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as a result of getting not enough nutrition, there are a whole range of terrible diseases. One of them is called angel wing. Just Google angel wing and you'll see some dreadful shots of swans and geese and other ducks and all sorts of things, which have feathers sticking out the side. They can't fly anymore. And it affects the way that the feathers grow for some strange reason. And those birds then can't fly away. They can't get away. And so they're more and more dependent on the food that's being provided for the people. So bread is completely out. Now, I've come across all sorts of things that you can safely feed the birds at the pond. Believe it or not, a favourite and completely harmless thing is frozen peas. Just take out some frozen peas from the freezer, or some cooked rice, not raw rice, because that could grow into rice. But cooked rice is fantastic as well. And there's a whole bunch of other things which are perfectly safe that isn't bread that you can encourage people to use.
Thank you. And there's one more question on the chat, which is from Jeff Pettifer, that birds get lots of seed from farmlands. This is largely unrecorded. What effect on birds does that have?
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, billions of galahs and white cockatoos and everything else are taking advantage of all the seed that's dropped in those grain crops and all that sort of thing. Ever since we've been have farming seed in Australia, that'll be going on. It'll be happening everywhere in the world. It is supporting some birds for sure, but it's very seasonal, so it's only around for a couple of weeks. A seed that's in the damp ground doesn't last very long, so that supply of food isn't really available all year round. So they might gorge on it for a while, but then it's all gone. So it's probably not much of an issue.
Okay. I'll just check whether there are more questions from people at home on Zoom. If people want to speak up or do the wave hand thing, I'll just scan and look quickly. I think they should jump up to the front of if they.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wouldn't planting trees be a better option than actual feeding them seed?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, not a better option, but it's just another way of doing it. Obviously, that's providing. So one of the things that's in that little pink book I'm trying to get away from is just thinking that the only way you can feed birds is put out food. You know.
The reason I ask, I've only sort of joined the club recently, and I live next door to a church, and I don't even have to do nothing. I just photograph the ones at the church.
So what are the birds doing at the church?
The church has got a ground where there's a lot of trees with different types of seed.
All right, yeah, cool. That's fine, absolutely. A lot of people. So if you've got the space, it's a really good idea to try and provide whatever habitat.
I went with on Tuesday, was it? Did you do the Tuesday one, Jack, or was that someone else? Yeah, and a lot of people were naming trees, and I had no idea what I was looking at.
Yeah, all right. Yep. Yeah. Now, there's trees. One thing we do have to be very careful about, and this is something that took everybody by surprise. You would think that getting nectivorous plants like the grevilleas and callistemons and banksias and all those kinds of things and sticking them in your backyard would be a fantastic way to attract birds. And if you go to the nurseries, that's what it says, bird attractors on these plants. You do attract them, noisy miners and rainbow lorikeets, and that's all you'll get. Because once those things start coming, you won't get anything else. So we didn't see this coming, and we should have. The huge amount of nectivorous plants now are available in Australian cities has totally changed the populations. The most abundant bird in Australia in cities, in every city, is rainbow lorikeets. They become the most abundant bird, entirely because of all the nectar that's available to them. And they're breeding like crazy, and they're out competing all sorts of other hollow nesting birds. So we are really changing things, and that's a native bird. We're really changing things. The noisy miners and the rainbow lorikeets are profoundly altering the composition of the birds that live in our cities because of that, because of the choices we've made of the types of plants. There's lots of plants we can plant that doesn't have that effect, and there's lots of information available as well.
There's another question come on chat from Karen asking, why is mince bad for feeding?
Yeah, okay. We do need to talk about mince, because mince is the most easy to get. It's so convenient. You just get it from the store. Everybody's got some for this bag bowl on the weekend or whatever. So it's easy. It's convenient. But it's a terrible sort of food. The trouble with it is it doesn't have enough calcium. And so if any animal eats too much straight meat, no animal in the world naturally eats just meat. We don't even eat just meat. If you don't have just a steak on your plate and nothing else, well, actually some people do. Yeah, no, I shouldn't say that. But most of the time we don't just eat meat. If you're a predator, you eat the bones and the fur and everything else that goes on. And as a balanced, all the different chemicals are all balanced up if you eat the whole animal, like the whole mouse or the whole anything. Just mince is terrible because it doesn't have enough calcium, and that can lead to metabolic bone disease, which, because birds need calcium all the time to replenish their growing bones, to make eggshells, all that sort of stuff, they have a storage of calcium in their bodies, and it's inside the bone, inside the marrow of the bone. If they don't have enough calcium in their diet, they'll start extracting that from their bones, and their bones will become brittle and even bent. And so that's one reason. The other reason, it's sticky. It's a strange subsistence. It looks really sticky and odd, and because of the way it's mashed up, and that can get caught in the groove underneath the upper mandible, the upper part of the bill, the beak, and that can get stuck in there, and that can cause all sorts of bacterial growth. And there are lots of magpies around who've lost half a bill because they had got some sticky mince caught up there. So I'm suggesting that we really must get away from the mince. At the moment, we don't have any products that for magpies and butcherbirds and kookaburras and all those sorts of other meat-eating birds. Until there is something coming, it's called Maggie Meals, and it's artificial worms. So it's an artificial product made directly of whatever worms are made out of, but you buy it from Woolies, from a pet food company, from pet food shelves. It's on its way. Meanwhile, you can just dig up worms, I guess. But until we get there, a much better idea is to feed pet food, cat or dog pet food. Now, it's not made for birds, but it's much more balanced than mince. There are, if you're willing to pay just a little bit more, there are all sorts of insectivorous pet foods that you can get from specialist pet food shops. I can't name them, but there are all sorts of things that you can get, usually with magpie on the cover. Wombaroo is the company that makes the best ones, and so you can use that as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Darryl. I will give opportunity for people here at the Wetlands Centre to ask questions if there are any. Yeah, well, there's a few. So there's two hands up. So we'll have Peter and then Alan, and then, oh yeah, we've got three. We've got loads of questions coming. Now I'm going to have to, either people can come up here and sit and ask them directly, or, yeah, that's going to be easier, or else.
Make it a simple question.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Simple question. I'm feeding birds chicken hearts.
Yeah.
They come and attack the chicken heart and fly off.
Yeah.
Is that bad for them, the chicken heart?
Okay. I'll find out. Okay, there's a question from the floor. Someone's feeding birds chicken hearts, and they want to know whether that's good or not.
Chicken heart, again, let's not be too, religious about it. A little bit of anything is okay. Too much is not a good idea. Meat, chicken hearts is just meat. It's not all the other bits and pieces that need it for nutrition. You can chop it up and add calcium powder, but most people won't be bothered doing that. If you were serious about, the birds love those things, they really do, but it's not necessarily. We love all sorts of things that are not good for us. Let's just face it, you can have too much of a good thing and it's not a good idea to do that. What I would recommend is keep feeding the chicken hearts, but get some Wombaroo product, some insectivore mince or whatever it's called, and add that to the chicken hearts, and then that should solve the problem. So it's, again, I'm not being too heavy-handed about this. Mince is a bad idea. We need to get away from it. But nothing in moderation, anything in moderation should be okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay. Oh, you got too long-winded a question.
No. I just I don't feed birds, but I put water out for them. Are there any issues about me doing that I should?
No, there shouldn't be a backyard in Australia that doesn't have a bird bath. That's absolutely, why would you, in a hot place like this, where it's increasingly hot, everybody should have a bird bath. The one issue is, though, that you can get minor problems with contamination. One of the things that happens in Brisbane and presumably lots of other places is the crows bring stale things and bread and stuff like that and stick it in the water, and that can contaminate things. If it's not cleaned out enough, you can get an algal growth. So they do need, like the feeder itself, and I should re-emphasise that, if you have a feeder, it must be cleaned every single day. You can't just let it build up with crap and stuff. You've got to clean it, or you will be almost certainly responsible for spreading disease. So if we're going to feed, we've got to keep it clean, and that is also the case with the bird baths. There's a lot of fantastic new bird bath designs out there, but what you need to do is make sure that they're really smooth on the surface, so that doesn't can capture. There's not a substrate for the algae and that sort of thing to grow. So just every couple of days, sweep it out and fill it up with clean water.
You coming over here?
Hey Darryl, Mark Simpson here. I'm a veterinarian who's involved in the bird club here. Yep. And I wanted to, first of all, congratulate you on bringing an evidence base to this area. I've been a passionate advocate for no one feeding anything to the wild birds for 3 decades now. And I've been constantly beating my head against the wall because people, as you said, keep doing it.
Yeah.
And your couple of books have definitely brought a good deal of science to it. I'm still very worried that the changed population dynamics, the changed behaviour at feeders is yet to, that we're likely to see a disaster in Australia disease-wise. Do you think we're likely to see problems, and do you think that we're surrendering to second best when we can't achieve the best by asking people not to feed?
Well, these are very important, sensible questions to ask. I just don't think that anyone's going to stop feeding. That's not going to happen. So we need to provide whatever information we've got. What I'm really trying to get across, and as much as I possibly can, is this idea that we're not providing all the food they needed. We can't possibly do that. And so we need to provide less food. We can still get the enjoyment, but less food is better for them. They're less likely to eat too much stuff that's bad for them. And so we don't want, and everybody probably in the audience knows that old lady or man down the back street who feeds 700 magpies every day. That's kind of another issue altogether, but that's just not good for anybody. It's just a really terrible idea. We need to really come back from that and just enjoy a few birds coming for a small amount of time. Don't put out too much food and put out the right sorts of food, and that's probably the best we can do. But I think those two massive diseases, outbreaks, absolute epidemics that occur in North America and now the UK, directly as a result of birds coming to feeders, has changed the atmosphere over there a lot. It's possibly, we're probably lucky we haven't had a thing like that at the moment. The scale of bird feeding over there is much higher than it is here. And there's just a lot more people and a lot more birds and a lot more feeders going out there. So we may be looking at that in the future, and that would be dreadful if that was the case.
We any more questions in the room? No, I'll just do one last check then at home on Zoom. I think we've covered everything in the chat. So unless anyone has a burning question they want to ask over Zoom, in which case, questions closed. I'm sure we could talk all night about this, Darryl. I mean, it is fascinating. I'd just like to thank you again for your talk tonight. It's been absolutely top notch, and a lot of education happening in amongst the membership as well. So it's good. Good to have the right information available, or else we can't make the right choices. So Brilliant. I'll just big round of applause, please. And we will have an HBOC mug posted out to you.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. Now, I'll go now, but I should just plug that book one more time. The Feeding the Birds at Your Table. Everything that you want to know is in that. So it's still available, plenty around. All right, guys. Thanks very much. I will say Peru.